Good evening. My name is Peter Christian Eigner. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to another conversation this evening. If you are not familiar with the Gotham Center, as always, I invite you to learn more about us online, where you can find nearly 1,000 essays, book reviews, event recordings, podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history at gothamcenter.org. We'll also be posting our spring online classes for adults soon at gothamed.com. Tonight, as part of our regular interview series, we'll be discussing this fantastic new book from Michael Glass entitled Cracked Foundations, Debt and Inequality in Suburban America. The book looks at post-war Long Island and examines how mortgages, bonds, and other debt instruments underwrote the upward mobility which defined that suburb in the decades after World War II, as well as the financial precarity which beset that suburb in recent decades. It is a powerful example of research which casts doubt on much of the received wisdom about this mythologized era. Today, more than 50 years into an historical period we sometimes call the Second Gilded Age because of its combination of low economic growth and very high inequality, the post-war decades truly do seem like the, quote, golden age of American capitalism, as they are now frequently called. But Glass masterfully uses Long Island to show that even in the richest suburb, there were cracks in the foundation of post-war American wealth that led directly into our current age of mass precarity. So without giving any more away, let me briefly introduce our guest tonight so we can quickly get into this conversation. Michael Glass is assistant professor at Boston College, where he specializes in 20th century urban and political history with a focus on how financial systems generate inequality and shape everyday life, from housing and education to environmental risk. His research has appeared in the Journal of American History, the Journal of Urban History, and other scholarly publications, including the Gotham Center blog, where he served as longtime editor. And his research has been supported by a number of prestigious academic institutions. He's also written for popular venues like the Washington Post and is currently working on a new book project that is very sure to generate public attention, tracing how a, quote, century of reckless housing development in Southern California turned wildfires into a recurring disaster. Before training as an historian, he also worked as a public high school teacher here in New York City. I'm also very, very happy to welcome back another long-standing editor of the Gotham blog, Susis J, who's kindly agreed to serve as our discussant this evening. Susie is an associate professor of history at St. John's University, where she teaches late 19th and 20th century U.S. history. She's a graduate of Dartmouth and Cornell, a recipient of numerous prestigious fellowships, and the author of Gentleman Bankers, The World of J.P. Morgan, published by Harvard Press in 2013. An expert in the study of business networks, her research bridges the divide between social and economic history through the innovative use of quantitative and qualitative methods. She's the trustee of the Business History Conference, co-chair of the Columbia's Economic History Seminar, editor of Financial History, and a member of the editorial advisory board of Business History Review. I'm always thrilled to welcome her here. So as usual, we have the chat function and the hand raising functions disabled in Zoom out of respect to our speakers, but I invite everyone in the audience to send in your questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen at any time during the next hour of conversation. Susie and Mike will go back and forth for the next hour or so until 7:30, and then we'll begin answering those questions. So with that mouthful, please join me in welcoming our guest tonight with the usual silent applause.
Thanks, Peter, and also thanks to the Gotham Center for hosting us and for all the attendees today. And of course, thanks to Mike for this remarkable book, which again, I'll just show you the cover. Well, one of the things I just wanted to start with, Mike, is can you tell us a little bit about how you came to this project?
Yes, sure. Maybe just before we get started, thank you to Peter and the Gotham Center. I think at this point it's nurtured like an entire generation of young historians of New York, myself being somebody who's really benefited from the center's programming and resources. And I'm just so thankful for opportunities like this. And thank you to all of you in the audience for being here. I know it's a busy time after the holiday, end of the semester coming. And most of all, thank you to Susie for reading my book and coming to talk about it tonight. I appreciate it. So yeah, this book, I think I came to it from a mix of my own personal experiences and intellectual interests. So probably the most important experience is I graduated college in 2008. rate as the world was falling down, banks were collapsing, and we learned all could be traced back to various financial instruments in the housing market that had kind of set off this global contagion. And I think it just sent me with these questions of, what happened? You know, how did we get to this place? And I think it's really the genesis moment for a new, what's been now called a new history of capitalism, which at least for me, a basic impulse is just to try to learn how these institutions and systems work, and then as a historian to try to trace their long history. So that's a big part of it. Also, after I graduated college, I taught high school, public high school in New York City for many years. And I loved the experience. I loved my students, but we did often struggle with having enough resources. I was also the soccer coach, and probably the most vivid memory was that so it was just me. We had a high school of 3,000 students with one soccer team, and I as the coach was everything, the trainer, the grounds crew. And so on my breaks from teaching, when it rained, I'd have to run out and mop the field to get rid of the puddles to make sure the game wouldn't be canceled, right? And this was a major contrast to my own upbringing in a relatively affluent suburb of Colorado, where our high school had not only one, but three immaculate fields, one for JV practice, one for varsity practice, and a stadium. And so, again, raised these questions about educational inequality, wanting to know where these kind of resource disparities came from. And so living in New York City, I just felt like this there's so much attention is often on places like New York City for educational politics, and we know far less about suburban regions. Maybe one last point of reference was that, as I was entering graduate school, the Black Lives Matter movement was really taking off. And for me, a major turning point was the Ferguson uprising after the murder of Michael Brown. And I was just struck by how some of the initial reporting was, calling Ferguson an urban community, an inner city community, a kind of convenient frame of reference, except for that, overlooking the fact that Ferguson is an independent suburb outside of St. Louis that actually at one point was an all-white FHA insured suburb. And so it raised this question of, uh, what's going on in American suburban regions. And I think there's a longer history here. So it pointed my attention to Long Island to explore these questions.
Well, when I was reading your book, I really got I had forgotten that you had graduated, after the financial crisis, but to me, it really shows a kind of maturity within the field of the histories of capitalism, because so much more, I feel like your work is part of this oeuvre that is looking at the mechanics of finance, but specifically around things like connecting different subfields like the history of education and the history of housing to financial history. And one of the things that I think makes your book so remarkable is that you really take on the challenge of making technical subjects like municipal bond financing and monetary inflation policy legible to general audiences, but even more so, I mean, one of the things that I loved about your book is the fact that you had to find out all of the municipal governances of all the towns and the unincorporated villages in Long Island, well, in Nassau County, in order to make your case and then do the actual research. But as I was telling you and Peter in the break, this was for me. I grew up in Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, and then moved to Long Island when I was in the third grade, and grew up in the Herrick School District, which you mentioned. That they had rejected a municipal bond financing in one of the chapters in 1957. And it really made me think of our education, like why weren't we actually taught these things in school? Why weren't we taught about, the things that really directly affect the kind of resources that affect our education or that of our neighbors? It's kind of like we're actually encouraged to turn a blind eye to what is happening in less wealthy districts, for example. And your argument that financial innovation in the form of debt instruments have actually created a shoddy deal for white suburban homeowners. I mean, that it's been even worse for Black homeowners in segregated districts like Roosevelt. and the way that our institutions like housing mortgages were designed to kind of perpetuate this inequality is, I think, really so important to know, but really difficult to grasp. How did you feel about, dealing with all those intricacies of looking at municipal bond financing?
Well, I'm glad that this is what you took from the book because it's kind of at the core of why I like being a historian. So I am interested in trying to understand big power structures, how they shape our lives, right? And specifically with capitalism, we have these abstract forces, interest rates, stock market indexes, Federal Reserve policy or whatnot, that are very important, and yet we can't touch or feel or necessarily see them except for in some sort of graphical representation, right? But then I'm interested in how ordinary people actually experience these things, right? What does it feel like to live through an interest rate bump? And actually, I'll say as an aside, when I wrote the book 5 years ago, started writing it, I was so worried. How do I explain to people
Mm,
that the difference between 2% and a 4% interest rate is a really big deal, even though it doesn't just sounds like a small number?
it's
Well, lo and
huge.
behold, we've lived
Yeah,
through a
right.
through a through an inflation spike, and you no longer have to make that case anymore, right? So maybe we have some renewed experience um, with this, but that's really what I was trying to do. So, you have to kind of understand how these systems and institutions work. But then I was really looking for examples of like, okay, well, how are ordinary people understanding these things, engaging with them, and sometimes challenging them politically in various campaigns. Uh, but I didn't necessarily have all of that kind of understanding when I started the project. I started like any historian with questions. Okay, let's go back. What's interesting is that Long Island's Nassau County specifically, its population explodes in the 1950s, doubles in 10 years. Um, how are all these kids going to school, right? How are all these new schools built? And very early on, when I started tracing this, I would find the kind of financial offerings to build new schools and see the bond offerings and see names like Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers, of course, as the intermediaries helping all the way back in 1950s, Levittown, for instance. And so, given my questions, I was like, okay, I think there's a story here. And I think what the story is that I try to bring forth from the book is that are specifically with education, maybe the most public of all public goods in America, right? Something that I think a lot of Americans take a lot of pride, investment in, that this is something that unless you're in private or parochial school, all Americans share this public resource. There is an inherent privatization underneath it when it comes to infrastructure. So to build schools, to get the money to build the infrastructure, public school districts need to get private financing. They have to go find someone to offer them the money. They have to essentially sell themselves to the bond market as an investment product. And I'll say here, what was so helpful is all of the organizing by the Debt Collective today, who I've followed very closely and worked with some. And they have this saying that, every debt is somebody else's asset.
Mm,
When you think of your college loan, when you think of your home mortgage, when you think of your medical debt, or when you think of your municipal bond for your school district, think about to somebody else, it's an asset. And so it's a total shift in the way we understand um, kind of like what makes that public good possible. And what I learned tracing the story from the initial kind of financial transaction carried through the life of the loans is that, well, first of all, it makes these processes far more expensive. Now you're paying interest and fees to all the middlemen. But the larger point I try to make in the book is it ultimately shapes people's worldviews in that, okay, maybe after you get through the initial construction, your debt repayment is a relatively small part of your annual budget as a school district. But it's such an important part um, that it shapes the worldview of school officials. So we have to always think about our credit rating, right?
mhm,
We can't do this, we can't do that, because the next time we go get a loan, we need to make sure we can get as low of an interest rate as possible, right? So
mhm,
it's kind of always in the background. And and through the 20th century, when you get into the 1970s and 1980s and onward, you start seeing even more short-term forms of borrowing, even to cover operational costs, right? So you see school districts borrowing to make payroll, month to month. And so then these pressures become even more intense because there's a kind of constant churn of borrowing. And this very much defines municipal governance, not only for school districts, but local governments across the country still today, that there's a constant relationship with the bond market that officials have to be attentive to. And, the argument I make is that it ultimately, in really kind of nefarious ways, warps the publicness of our public institutions.
Can you talk a little bit about, because I think this is such an important point in your book, about how the borrowing at the municipal bond market leads to relative uneven levels of higher taxes in certain districts than others, and that this puts pressure on homeowners where they could either stay and deal with things like unfinished schools where your kids are actually not going to school for the whole day for periods of like 15 years actually, which I don't think people realize. I went, wow, on the side, or they're incentivized to leave, right, to sell. They were part of the community that agreed to do the municipal bond issue, and then they can sell and they kind of cash out their equity and they leave the problem for someone else, or they have to resort to, and this leads to the rise of, as you mentioned, this very large informal housing market in the right, that as people develop their own survival strategies to deal with these institutions that they don't have control over, that they're kind of beholden to, that it leads to other kinds of historical phenomena that we're seeing in housing in Long Island.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to start at the beginning, maybe I should have said already, Nassau County is an interesting and important case study because of its extreme fragmentation. It's the one county just east of Queens, 1.2, 1.3 million people, 56 different school districts. Uh, so again, it's extreme, but there are many metropolitan areas around the country that's very similar to it. It's a lot like Chicago. It's a lot like Boston, where I am. It's a lot like Los Angeles, different from other parts of the country that might not have such proliferation of small governments. But this is a really foundational issue for public education because the main funding source is property taxes. The local property wealth within the school district is the main source of funding for the schools, which means that wealthier areas, and wealthy could mean more expensive houses. Wealthy could also mean more lucrative businesses, shopping malls,
You mentioned
factories,
the Miracle Mile, right?
data centers.
Which is now
Yeah.
Americana.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Data centers today.
yeah.
All of this wealth means that you can actually pay a lower rate and generate more revenues, right? This is like just an ongoing inequality of the way we finance schools in America. I mean, I'll say it's an ongoing injustice. It's not a huge surprise. What is a big, at least revelation for me, is that this has additional consequences in that all 56 of those districts in Nassau County, when they need to build schools or do other kinds of infrastructure projects, have to go to the bond market alone.
Mm.
And so what I argue in the book is it has a compounding effect. It's actually a cause and it exacerbates and makes worse the inequalities because when a relatively poor district goes to borrow, they'll usually get a lower credit rating from rating agencies like Fitch or Standard and Poor or Moody's. And then that means that when they get their loans, they'll pay a higher interest rate as compared to a wealthier district that would get a higher credit rating and a lower interest rate. And it's not only that, there's a kind of pile-on effect. So now I'm, say, a poor district that just paid a lot for a loan, and now in my budget every year, I have high repayment costs. What happens the next time I need to build something? The first thing on my budget is that you have high debt repayment costs, so now your credit rating goes down even more, right? And so it adds and adds and adds. And so it's, I think, what I argue in the book, one of these key reasons that we see even during the golden age of capitalism, this time in post-World War II, maybe we can talk about, which, at least compared to today, seemingly had far more opportunities for Americans. We see deepening inequality. We see school districts growing further apart year by year. And I argue that debt is a main cause of this. And, to tie it to kind of some of the housing aspects, there are all kinds of knock-on effects to that financial pressure. Tax rates, property tax rates going up every year to repay the debt, in addition to all the other expenses like paying teachers and all the other ongoing funding needs for school districts. That over time puts increasing pressure on the kind of homeowner relationship of maybe I bought this house because the price seemed right and I saw a tax rate. I looked at the numbers and it seemed to work for me. And maybe I even, stretched a bit because we wanted to get, the biggest house possible or the nicest school district possible or whatnot. But the thing that came as a real surprise to a lot of the suburbanites I chronicle over the post-war era is the continual increasing pressure of tax rates going up every year and the schools being in such turmoil that, as you mentioned, yeah, a major finding of the book is that Levittown School District, this iconic post-World War II suburb, had so much trouble building schools through this process that elementary students were going split into half a day for the first 15 years, right? And so I guess the a major effect of this I found is that at least when it was possible, say in the 1950s and 60s, an incredible amount of turnover. I found people selling and moving very quickly. And this is something, again, I think we sometimes miss about the post-war era, that it's not like post-war generation of Americans, bought their suburban house and now they had suddenly made it in America and life was perfect. No, it's just the beginning of what I call in the book a highly speculative and kind of unsteady process. We got the house in the suburb, but now the schools are on half a day and the taxes go up every year. But we have this opportunity to, maybe sell now because the prices are going up and get another house somewhere else. Is now the right time? We don't know. I mean, and again, I think this is important because I think it probably sounds very familiar to some of the, housing pressures that a lot of people experience today. And what I want to try to show in the book is that this is kind of baked into the system. It's not entirely
Yes.
new, right? The kind of FOMO of the housing market, right, was really there in the right after World War II moment. And I argue it kind of, these systems are kind of set in place and build up some of the pressures over time that produce what we're familiar with today.
Well, I was just in Dallas, and the front page of the metro section of the Dallas Morning News is actually talking about these new housing developments that have been built. And one of the homeowners was talking about how when he turned on his taps, his lights would flicker. And I was like, wow, this is just like Mike's book, because one of the things and the fact that it's still going on, and this is, 60, 70 years or, after Levittown is, and I think that people will be surprised when they read it, is when you had white suburbanites leaving places like the Bronx or Brooklyn to move to these newly developed housing developments, is that they didn't have sewers. They didn't have schools, and they were shoddily built, right? Which is where your title comes from. And so, and I thought it was remarkable that you're getting this testimony actually from the archives where they're like writing these desperate letters, like about, we thought we were going to move here, and I'm desperate for my child to get an education. Or they didn't lay 4 inches of concrete down on the floor. They only laid one, and now the water keeps pouring in. So one of the things I think that's very powerful about what it is that you're describing is that in many cases, they're getting really a bad deal on top of the baked in the cake infrastructure that is constantly piling on more financial pressure. What is it that they felt that they were actually, I mean, for those of people who did not just kind of sell and leave, because then the economic incentive is clear, right?
Yeah.
Because
Well,
they're basically cashing out their equity. What are they getting for their pain is what I'm saying.
yeah, and maybe we should table and talk about this is all operating within the world of all white suburbanization in the 1950s. So in a moment, we can talk about the racial exclusions and segregation, how that structures all of this as well. Right now, we're talking about these white veterans of, post-World War II generation. So one thing I try to emphasize at the beginning of the book is I think we've kind of forgotten in our sort of golden era imagination of post-World War II America, the kind of like Leave It to Beaver version of the 1950s, is
Mhm.
how intense and disruptive the war mobilization was, and
Mhm.
how intense and disruptive the post-World War II housing crisis was.
Mhm.
It's I lecture on it to my undergrads. It's a kind of familiar story. Veterans came home, had to stay in their parents' attic and double up with their friends until they could, save up enough to buy a house. But I think so like an iconic story here is part of the mythology of Levittown is that people camped out for 3 days just to see the model home. Not to see the house, but to put a down
Yeah,
payment on a house that didn't exist yet. And this is part of often folded into a story of America. It's people were so optimistic, so hopeful, so excited. And I mean, we can never know how they felt, but I'm trying to offer a reinterpretation saying, what kind of mindset do you have to be in to camp for 3 days? To put a down payment on a house. This is like utter desperation. I found a master's thesis where a sociology student went and interviewed like 100 first generation Levittowners, and they asked them, why did you buy this house? And the largest response, like 51%, was because it was the only thing available. Right? Like that there's a kind of limited options at the time. And so I locate this in federal policy, right? That we are
Mhm.
in a moment of intense housing shortage. What's coming from Congress, and they're very explicit about the goal in Congress, is we need to build as many houses as fast as possible, right? And there's already been a decision made in America by the post-war era that that's going to be through a public-private model, not
Exactly.
through public housing. And that's kind
Not
of,
through public
yeah,
housing.
that fight has already been had in the 30s and 40s. And so what that means is that how do you get private developers to build a lot of housing as quickly as possible? Lots of subsidies, lots of incentives, and ways to maximize profits, right? So I stumbled across there were hearings all over the country in the 50s where House committees toured the country and listened to people saying, I bought this house, I thought it was great, and a week later it started leaking. A week later
Mhm.
the foundation in the basement cracked. Um, and for whatever reason, these have just been completely overlooked. And so I think it comes from this moment of desperation. There were serious compromises and consequences to the policy decision to do this through a public-private model and kind of hastily as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, so I think that's so I guess to put yourself in the mindset of one of these like white suburbanites who gets, we should also emphasize that this um, was a heck of a deal for what it was, right? So if you're a white veteran after World War II with the insurance from the Federal Housing Administration, coupled with the veteran benefits from the GI Bill, you could in many cases buy a brand new house for no money down and monthly mortgage payments that were often cheaper than rent. That is absolutely true. I talk about this with my undergrads teaching, and their jaws just drop. It's unimaginable today. Um, but it's classic. Anybody who's been a homeowner knows that one of the enduring features of homeownership is unexpected costs and surprises, right? And so I think as historians, we've kind of missed that may all be true, but as any homeowner can tell you, just because that the costs you're going to have as a homeowner are often going to be far more than that monthly mortgage payment, right? The insurance, the property taxes, the repairs, the all kinds of other stuff comes later. And this is, I think, what came as a surprise to a lot of people, especially people who are first-time homeowners, right? Looking back, we can say you still got a heck of a deal. But I was surprised that they were upset and they were angry and they were going to Congress. And I'll just say lastly, maybe we can get into some of the racial inequality. Um,
Yep.
I think what people learn over time is that, okay, you don't get a perfect house, you don't get a perfect life, you don't get perfect schools, but you do get kind of a leg up in what I call like a financial asset that, fast forward a few years And suddenly your house is worth 10, 20, 30% more. And you have this opportunity to sell it at a profit and move into a bigger house, a more stable school district and whatnot. One of them, again, the one big finding, 1950s, the average stay in Levittown is 5 years. I call the chapter starter home. People don't use the exact language as we do today, but I found a lot of uh, sources and reports of people saying, this is just my first house. I mean, heck, very quickly have a shift in mindset. I'm just here as a step to something else. I mean,
Well, the change
wow.
in the
Yeah.
tax code in 1951 also encourages this,
Yes. Yeah,
right?
there's all kinds of policy tweaks that to try to encourage housing resales. There's a big a change in income taxes to exempt capital gains. I don't know if anybody in the audience has experienced this. If you sell a house that has appreciated a lot in value, it's technically a capital asset, and you would have to pay capital gains taxes on it as if you had liquidated a stock. 1951, real estate lobbyists go to Congress and say, this is going to be a major snag in our housing system because those bigger houses that we're starting to build in the mid 50s, the main market for those are existing homeowners of smaller houses. And if they can't sell their house and use the money for a bigger house, it's going to clog the whole housing market. So there's an exemption written in 1951 that if you sell your house, you can exempt the capital gains if it goes into the down payment of a bigger house. Essentially, just encouraging people to trade up, as the language was. All kinds of tweaks in mortgage policy to try to have more and increasingly generous mortgage credit to allow people to afford those bigger houses. None of this lasts, we should say. The
Right,
financial,
exactly. It's like it's a windfall for a very small group of
it,
people
it does
within a
last for,
particular period of time.
yeah, 10,
Yeah,
15 years already by
exactly.
the 60s and certainly by the 70s as inflation, um, mortgage rates shoot up, deindustrialization starts coming, and people's wages stagnate. So it breaks down. But this is, I think, the thing that made the system work for a generation of people, right?
Exactly.
That okay, life's not perfect, we'll sell it in a few years, right?
Well, this is the thing is that the rise in the housing market, which enables them as a safety valve to leave, this is which of course is racialized, as you said, right, is what kind of is like the engine. It's part of the institution that allows the from people to kind of come in and benefit from the system. And I think this is also, very clearly where your book intersects with the studies in the subfield on whiteness. And I was wondering if you could talk, because I think it's obviously very important. Because so far, as you said, and you mentioned this in your book, you said let's just remember that up until now, I've basically been talking about white homeowners, right? And the picture looks obviously different for veterans who were prevented from, they had also access to the GI Bill, but they couldn't buy in the same neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know if people in the audience are familiar, 90s and early 2000s, there's a really big literature on whiteness studies, saying white people have race too. What does it mean to be white? How has being white changed over time? Questions like, when did the Irish become white? When did Jewish people become white? When did Italians become white? A lot of this literature was in kind of a identity framework in the ways I've just explained it. A culture, when do you understand yourself as a white person as opposed to an Italian person, right? That work was all really valuable. I'll say in the book, what I'm trying to bring is kind of a material sensibility to whiteness, meaning that I'm not so interested in my account of how people understand themselves, right?
Hmm.
Do I think of myself as Italian anymore when I move to, say, Massapequa, Long Island in 1950s? I don't know. For me, the key determining factor is the getting access to the kind of state benefits, the GI Bill and the FHA insurance, right? Because what that is a race-making institution. Because I mean, we probably should emphasize it from the beginning. This value appreciation is all premised on segregation. right?
Right.
So we should
Exactly.
wind back and talk about this federal system of federally insured mortgages has is now colloquially known as redlining, right? The basically saying allowing the real estate and appraisal industry to design their own policies for what federal insurance will look like for an industry that had built itself in the early 20th century around segregation. What does it mean to live in a good neighborhood, quote unquote, a stable neighborhood, a place that will retain its value over time, was inherently racialized from the beginning of this system. And so, I mean, this is partly where I try to make also an argument against some of the, I guess I would call it today, like kind of like a racial wealth gap, a kind of racial liberalism approach to racial inequality being, and what I mean by that is like saying, hey, the solution to the racial wealth gap is to have more people of color become homeowners because they were locked out,
Right.
right? And I think
And
what that misses
exactly.
is that the whole enterprise of asset appreciation and homeownership in America remains thoroughly racialized. I don't necessarily think it's a system that can ever provide for everyone equally. Now, does that mean people of color should never buy houses? No, of course not. I mean, people, make choices and make do with the best they can. But as policy, right, we need to really, I think about what solutions to racial inequality, what challenging that valuation system would mean. I'll say a mentor of mine, Kianga Yamada Taylor, wrote a very influential book where she used this phrase, predatory inclusion, right? So if we say, let's just include previously excluded populations without changing fundamentally how these systems work, sets what King and Mata Taylor showed sets the stage for exploitation and predation.
Right.
And
Super
she,
exploitation.
yeah,
They're actually paying a much more higher
and
percentage
and
and higher
she
interest rates.
and she traces a story of black homeownership in the 1970s, and I find very similar things among black suburbanites on Long Island. And I think it's an analytic you could apply to something like the subprime mortgage bubble, right?
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
to say, let's just get credit in the hands of previously excluded populations, and that itself is our goal. With not, thinking about the terms of the inclusion, which actually devastated the wealth of Black and Latino and Asian households in the subprime bust, right? This is the kind of argument I'm trying to trace back in the book to say, let's think about how white homeowners actually benefited from this rigged system, essentially what it is, and that's the thing we need to challenge, not take the system as great and just include more people in it, if that makes sense.
Yes. Well, I think that your examples, I do want to talk about solutions in a second, but of landlords who are both black and white, people like Calvin and Gertrude Tan or James Northrop, who are both landlords of multiple, who are black, respectively black and white, own multiple properties in black areas in Long Island, like Roosevelt, and basically walked away from properties as they depreciated and then left a weakened tax base and also dilapidated housing that people couldn't actually live in. Do you know what actually happened to them or where they ended up?
No, so these are great examples. I should just start with, some principles here where so I'm looking at a materialist perspective on whiteness. I'm also, I think I would characterize as kind of like a structural racism framework, right? So I'm not so interested in did so and so have personally racist beliefs or not. I'm interested in how racist systems operate to distribute power and resources between groups. And I think one thing I've learned from recent scholarship that often goes by, racial capitalism or structural racism, what have you, is that first, what structural racism does is often make good people do terrible things, right? This is a dilemma I think a lot of adults in America deal with. Am I a racist for moving into a gentrifying neighborhood? Am I a racist for buying into a homeownership system that still values white people far more than anybody else? I mean, this is the kind of dilemmas I'm interested in, right? And a variant of that question is that segregation and racism have such inherent profitability in the American real estate system that I found many examples of well, particularly in the era I'm looking at, there's a very black-white racial dynamic on Long Island. The kind of immigration and diversity comes a bit later. But black real estate developers who, for instance, would help black homeowners buy houses in previously all-white neighborhoods, but charge higher prices for their services because they'd make money on the margin. Is that racist? I don't know. I'm not so interested again in calling people racist or not. I found many black landlords in historically African American suburbs who what their business became was buying up foreclosed houses and illegally renting single family houses to multiple families and making pretty good business for it. Now, what that did was provide affordable rentals, but it also subjected people to unsafe and very crowded living conditions. Again, I'm not so interested in, is so and so racist or not, but showing that this is kind of what structural racism means, right? That it's
And I
not
think
about good guys
yeah,
and bad
yeah,
guys. It's about kind of a system of organizing behavior, right?
right.
And creating, I guess, on the kind of business side, creating like niche markets, right? Somebody needs to provide affordable housing in a suburban landscape where there are very few apartments or public housing. It ends up being, I follow at the end, later in the book, landlords who find opportunities to chop single family houses into apartments, with
Yep.
all of the kinds of the dilemmas that come with that, right? And so that's the kind of story I'm trying to tell. And I'll just say lastly, yeah, so I think hopefully what this points to is rather than asking that question, the personal motivations or beliefs of a particular individual, thinking about ways to disrupt and challenge and ultimately, dismantle these systems of racism, right? These that are so powerful.
Yeah. Well, my thing is, I mean, I totally agree with you because I think that when we ask the question of who benefits, what we're trying to do is understand how these institutions actually function, right? And they are incentivizing, exactly as you say, people to follow what seems to be, honestly, their rational economic interest because it's profitable for them, right? And to me, this is a question of like, what are the institutions that are underwriting this kind of inertia? And this gets to the question of what are the solutions, right? Because what's in your book, you talk about the Levittown versus Nyquist lawsuit in 1978, and where by this time, this in 1978, as you state, the New York State court makes a declaration that New York State school financing is unconstitutional because it relies so much on local property taxes, it violates the Equal Protection Clause, education clauses of the state constitution. And so it seems like there is this moment in which there is this solution, and then it's clawed back in 82 when that decision is reversed by the New York State Court of Appeals. And when I was reading that, I was like, how does that happen? You know what I mean? Like, why is it that there's so much pull with a very small group of that is seemingly benefits, or are the benefits just kind of more widespread, that there isn't this kind of political appetite for the kind of what you say at the very end of the book, the need for this whole scale transformation that needs to happen, And so yeah, I was just wondering if you could talk about like the solutions that were suggested and like the paths not taken really.
No, this is a great question. Thank you for getting to this stuff because we've talked a lot about the problems. The book also chronicles a lot of the social movements and activism around these issues. And so the most kind of dynamic and robust activism was around the schools in this era. So we should say first there is a very powerful school integration movement that really came from the grassroots. And this was often in districts on Long Island that had a mixed race enrollment, so groups sharing the same school district. And often what happened there'd be a school district and racial concentrations in different parts of the school district that played out in elementary schools. And what this did in the era of Brown v. Board is create a kind of template and landscape to challenge school integration on a much more manageable scale. We're talking like a small Long Island school district with 3 elementary schools, and two of the schools are all white, and one is predominantly black. And so what often black parents did with the help of civil rights groups was literally just, well, first petition and demand to be let into the all-white schools that often have better resources, and then when denied access, literally boycott schools and march to them, and just incredible activism. I will say, though, I was sort of surprised to dig into it. At least on Long Island, the school integration activism kind of runs into a dead end because it all operated, the court battles in particular, and the state legislation and federal legislation all operated within school district boundaries, right? So what that meant is somewhere like Levittown, an all-white suburb, it's like school integration never happened. Right. And even for districts that become nearly all black, like Roosevelt is a district I talk about, the school integration order is just revoked because there's nothing left to integrate. So it's very intense and it's very consequential in a small number of places. And this is kind of, I don't know, it's another one of these things I want people to wrestle with that we forget sometimes that like for how powerful the school integration era was, in many ways it was very limited by design. And so from there, a lot of the battles go into school funding. And actually, this is a place where at the end of the book, I take a lot of like hope from this because this incredible thing happens in the 70s where there's a lot of cross-district organizing around school funding that eventually first plays out with lobbying. Once these property tax disparities and bond arrangements are kind of set in place, the political demand becomes we need to ask Albany for more money, for
Right.
more aid to equalize, which is written into the kind of state funding structures. It's nominally for equalization. And so there's this ongoing lobbying battle. When that kind of hits obstacles, this turns into a class action lawsuit. So interesting for me, for my study, that there's, yeah, as you said, a 1978 class action lawsuit that invalidates property taxes in the entire state of New York. And it started in Levittown. Levittown's the plaintiff. And the main allies are 10 or so strained districts on Long Island, but also New York City, Yonkers, Buffalo, and small rural districts around Western and upstate New York. And so I call it at the end of the book a statewide, multiracial, cross-class alliance. So that these what I saw was struggling districts thinking about finding allies beyond their own boundaries who were dealing with similar issues and trying to think about shared solutions. And this played out in class action lawsuits. I should say, people are familiar with this. This has been an ongoing saga where pretty much every state in America at this point has had a lawsuit like this. And often plays into protracted negotiation because, well, what I show in the book is they won in 1978, property taxes are invalidated. It starts a whole new battle. Okay, so what do we do now? Right? What does funding look like? All kinds of interesting proposals, but on appeal, they lose in 1982.
Right.
And so the property tax system stays. I'll say, what I talk about in the epilogue, the school funding suits that are going on still in New York today pick right up from there. And they change litigation strategies. They make a little bit different arguments. And so this battle is going on, to this day right now. There was a big settlement a few years ago. The question now is if the state's going to pay up, right? But this is, I think, thinking about solutions is something I want to point to is thinking about alliances, broader connections between people. And I just found this so incredible, given everything I've said about segregation and inequality, that people are reaching beyond these boundaries and working together. And I think something like this is what it would take to kind of design, better systems of school funding in this case.
Well, I feel like there's a couple of things happening. First is that I think your book really makes the point that you can't look at things like education and housing separately.
Mhm.
That if you don't combine an analysis of these two institutions, that you're not going to really be able to think about viable solutions. The other thing I think is that, and we talked about this, David Backer's book who was at Seton Hall, As Public as Possible, which is on radical finance for Americans' public schools, also talks about the need to get rid of the property tax basis system for funding public schools and to think about what you talk about in your book. I mean, in a kind of limited strategy way, Governor Hugh Carey, right, was suggesting this like educational equity fund where it's not based that financing is not based on property taxes, which favors rich districts to be better funded than poorer districts, but that you're trying to leverage across the states government funding. But what's so difficult to sell that institutional change? It's so protracted. And I think that's why you said, what we really need is this kind of whole scale transformation is because it is basically a financial solution that you're trying to come up with, but it's a political problem, right?
Yeah, and I mean, on this school funding in particular, I'll say maybe one lesson that I landed on in the book is that New York is as a state is an interesting case for school funding because it is there's an ongoing competition, but in the period I'm looking at in the 70s and 80s, New York is the highest taxed state in the country, has everything. Business taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, all kinds of fees that constitute the state revenue. So from the state's perspective, that's great because Albany has a really robust tax base. We need money. Do we go to the sales taxes, the income taxes, the business taxes, the fees? The problem that I got to at the end of the book is that as all of those revenues had been added through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, the ongoing political fight in Albany was often powerful legislators often demanding, even if in name, this school funding aid was for equalization, often and demanding distribution even to wealthy districts, right? So
Right.
what you
Which they were
see,
loath to give up
yeah,
because
so what you
it
see over
felt like,
time,
yeah,
yeah, is a dilution. And
yes.
anybody who's worked in school funding politics knows this. A dilution where like state aid is and from a policy perspective, it's easier to pass funding increases if you have everybody on board. How do you get everybody on board? You cut everybody a slice. The downside is then how much equalization is happening if there's a slice given out to everybody, right? The lesson that came up in these litigation battles that's happening all across the country, the states that have moved decisively towards more equal school funding, Vermont, New Jersey are big examples. Often what happens is lawsuit comes down, need to have more funding equalization. What do? We add a new funding source that is explicitly for equalization. The
Right. Like
problem
the
in
lotto.
yeah, yeah, like the lotto, or there are states still to this day who still don't have an income tax, right? And you could add an income tax. New Jersey does actually adds the income tax with the stated goal of funding equalizing education. The problem in New York is they've already added everything, and when this lawsuit comes down, for those of us to put our minds in the 1978, it's probably the worst possible time. It's the fiscal
Yes.
crisis. Everybody's broke, and so I call it in the book kind of a tragedy. But I think there is a lesson there, which is that if we care about educational equality and funding equity, it needs to be a priority all the time, in good times and in bad times, right? And not just because once you get to bad times and you're trying to do redistribution, take money from somebody, give it to somebody else, it's very, very hard to accomplish politically, right?
Yes,
But
because of behavioral economics, they're going to feel it as a loss because they've already decided that it's an entitlement. The other issue I think that is really important, as you said, like this is happening at a time where the sense of largesse, right? The Great Society and all of that kind of feeling, right? Because you're covering such a long period of time, actually, is declining. And the other, I think, unspoken story that's happening here is that this entire time, the United States is basically involved in the Cold War.
yeah,
So you're talking about austerity in the context of a very expensive U.S. imperial foreign policy that's happening, right? So the idea that this fund is going to come from somewhere, right? Either if not the state, then the federal government, while the federal government is pursuing these very expensive imperial anti-colonial capitalist wars abroad adds kind of another, dimension to that story about financing. And I actually feel like the next step in your story is to tie
Yeah.
that in, is to look at that kind of financing, right? Because at some point, the state is going to be going to the federal government and saying, we need more money from you.
Yes. Yes. No, totally. And then that's the kind of stuff that's getting pulled back, um, decisively so in the Reagan administration, right? But it
Exactly.
starts with Nixon. It starts with Nixon, turning into, grants that aren't entitlement fundings to various programs anymore. They're now, block grants. So that stuff happens. And, maybe another element of that as well that comes up in the book in a bit. Inflation and financial instability really undermines a lot of these systems,
Yes.
you go from people in the post-war era kind of getting used to 4 to 5% mortgages and school
Yep.
districts getting used to paying 2 or 3% on their bonds to 10, 15, 20%. Now it's a huge debate among economists, and don't quote me on this, but a primary cause, I think certainly we can say, of this inflation is the war in Vietnam, right? And there are, various other factors, global competition, deindustrialization, kinds of currency battles around the world. But yeah, it's kind of coming full circle, right? That I guess I'll say maybe pertinent to my book. I'll say it took me a long time to settle on this, but like, okay, so why did people think like, say, municipal bonds are a good idea? Or that kind of like a debt financed home mortgage system is the way to go for not just that this is should be the primary model of how we deliver housing and education. I think it kind of is that there is this post-war moment, and it's true. I mean, we could call it a golden age of capitalism. I don't know what if you want, where you coming out of World War II, the other kind of industrial powers around the world are destroyed. The U.S. is the kind of the only power on the map, right? And there's a lot of pent-up demand for investments, and what that means is that there's low interest rates. So you you have school bonds are at 1 or 2% in 1950s. Just if you could go to an official today and say you could do your big project for 1 or 2%, they would jump for joy. And I think there was kind of just an expectation that this was the new normal, right?
Mhm.
And actually, I chronicle early in the book congressional hearings. Should we have federal aid for school construction? There's a hearing every year in the 1950s. And there's all kinds of reasons. Brown v. Board is big. Regional differences, is Alabama the same as New York, the same as Oregon? This is a big question. What
Are
about
you going to be required to integrate if you go
yeah,
to
what about
school?
parochial schools?
Yep.
But one issue that is there kind of more quietly that I think hasn't got attention is the bankers come to testify and they say, there is no problem, we can handle it. And I think there's a lot of trust built up in these systems that erodes later. But going back to the beginning of the story, I think that is kind of, at least in my interpretation, a big part that we've kind of overlooked, that there's just this sense that, these systems work well, and it becomes clear very quickly that they don't, but that choice has been made already.
This is absolutely when I was reading your book, because I think so much about banking networks and these kind of personal networks as institutions. It's like there's something happening here where they have faith in the market and faith in the banks that say we're going to leave this, the societal good and the societal right institution that affects the like all people to Wall Street
Yeah.
and monetary policy, right? Even in this context of the Cold War, and this where I think the storytelling that people to say, that you talked about how the suburbanization is so nostalgized, that there's a story that people are telling themselves um, that make it possible, to not be critical about this system, which is frankly, and I think one of the most surprising takeaways of your text is that it's not really working for most people. And you would think that it's racialized, but it's actually much more complex than that. That I know we have a limited time because people have questions too. So I had two questions for you, and I'm going to let you choose which one. And that is, one is what surprised you in doing the book? Or what is the takeaway that you want people to leave with when you do your book?
Well, I think I've got to some of the surprises, the the half-day schools, the broken houses, the illegal renting. All of those were surprises that I wasn't expecting. Uh, as far as takeaways, maybe in the Q&A we could talk more about, of course, what would a better school financing system look like? What would a better housing policy look like? I don't have the answers. I have ideas, right? But as a historian, what I want people to take from my book is kind of a new understanding like of this era and of this kind of nostalgic sense of what post-war America was. There were many opportunities. There was a lot of excitement, right? There were just in retrospect, really just conditions that seem unimaginable today. However, I think what I want to show is that many of the problems that we experience today, the affordable housing crisis, school segregation, um, school funding issues, on and on. These are not new problems, right? They didn't suddenly appear sometime late in the 20th century. They didn't suddenly appear 10, 20 years ago. What I want to show in the book is that they are kind of the long-term process and outcome that we can trace even to back when we think things were working so well. Because what that points to is instead of saying, how do we get back to when things worked perfect? We should ask about how do we think better. And I'll say, I think this is still so important to our politics. I mean, what is Make America Great Again, if not a story about when was America great and for who? I mean, and even among progressives, the Green New Deal is a story. We need to do big things. When's the last time we did big things? The New Deal, right? I totally understand this impulse, but like what I'm saying is that this kind of sense of nostalgia, I think, is so strong and powerful still today. And it's that I think we need to change that story a bit if we want to actually address these problems and design more stable and inclusive systems.
Great, thanks, Mike. I know that we have a couple of questions. Peter, you want to
I do, and
take
I'm going to invite everyone again. Remind you all to send in your questions with the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. That's how we get your questions. The hand raising function does not work, and the chat will not work.
Oh, okay.
Mike, I actually just want to jump in and kind of ask the question that was behind the last bit of conversation here. I'm not actually familiar with any work in suburban history where they sort of ask this question, when did this kind of narrative start coming around? Because, I'm listening to you talk, and it's obviously one of the things that I love about your book too. In my book, I'm trying to fight that sort of nostalgia about the post-war era too, which would have been so kind of mystifying to people, even with a recognition of the opportunities that we were talking about in the last hour. It would be amusing to kind of read a lot of the commentary that's happening at the time, right? Whether in the archives, in your case, about the people who are buying these Cape Cods in Levittown and wherever else, or the stuff that's being written up in the magazines, and be like, oh, this is like, the peak age of happiness in America,
Yeah.
and it's like there's no inequality, and like, and I wonder, is that something that's kind of, when does that sort of come around? I know that's not really the part of the purview of your book, but I think that you're so right about this question about what I would say is the danger of these kinds of narratives. And I would second your point about it being in danger on both sides of the political fence.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm like having nightmares in my mind because I have one of my colleagues at Boston College is an expert in memory, and I can see his like furrowed eyebrow. Like, he wants me to. So it's I don't have the whole memory story. I
Yeah.
have some hunches,
Yeah.
but I think what I found in my story is a couple things. I really think the breaking point is a generational aspect. It's the moment, say 10, 15 years later, when the children of the first generation suburbanites can't have the same expectations or entitlements anymore. The classic, my own kids can't afford to live in my own community, right? Which causes a whole kind of disruption. And I mean, this is really kind of stunning. I mean, there's many reasons for it. There's a decline in births. There's a rise in divorces and whatnot, but the Nassau County population actually shrinks in the 1970s, and a large reason also is the outmigration. And so I think this kind of instigates a sort of reflection, like what was it like when it used to be affordable? Right? But I even found earlier versions of this. I read many memoirs of first generation suburbanites, and I often found the same story. It was usually the same. I loved our parents' first little house. All my memories are there. But then we moved away,
Mhm.
and this kind of like reckoning with it. We
Mhm.
had to move to the house with the bigger air conditioner or the extra bedroom or the
Sure.
even the, right? And it kind of, I mean, I say it's kind of like it's like mixed motions about it, right? I loved it and we left. I'll say also the memory is tricky because I interviewed a lot of people, right? And I said, what was your experience like being one of the first residents in Levittown? What I would often hear from people is amazing. We were pioneers. Everything was great,
Right. Right.
and like I didn't really want to talk about that directly because I'd even say like, well, here's a letter from your mom who's really stressed out, or here's a picture of your kindergarten class where you're like in a gym class, right? Like I'm not saying your life wasn't perfect. I'm just saying like, do you remember any of this? But there is a powerful memory thing that happens where
Yeah.
one thing I have learned from memory studies is when you hear nostalgia, it's often about something happening in the present. If we say
Mm.
things used to be
100%.
great, yeah, we're usually saying something's not great today. Long Island, like so much of America, is totally unaffordable. And if you don't recognize how segregated it is, you have to be blind, right? And so there has to be like a. So I think that's where the nostalgia comes. But yeah, it happens pretty early. It's that generation, like sometime around the 60s and 70s, where the bargain's already breaking down for people.
Well, I don't know if Gary would agree, but we have several comments from a listener named Gary writing that increasingly, both in rural and urban America, the student population is decreasing as infrastructure ages and goes obsolete. And in the land of Leave It town, young families cannot even afford a down payment, taxes, or interest rates, and homeowners insurance has become difficult to find, especially at sea level Long Island. Yeah, I mean, these are things that you hear all the time. So Joe McGowan writes, with a new push towards abundance, a la Ezra Klein, and a possible move towards future or deregulation, are there lessons in your research that could inform the search for a balance of growth and regulation?
Yes, yes. I thank you. This is great. And this is a great question. Something I didn't talk about, which is worth just mentioning quickly. There's an early episode in my book where, so there's the construction fights in Congress. There's another big set of congressional fights, which is over financing. And what became clear is that, so basically the federal model of suburbanization is um, offer federal government insurance on the mortgages for suburban developments. And so what that does is that if I'm, say, William Levitt, I can go to a bank, take out a giant mortgage to build Levittown houses, and the bank sees me as a perfect investment, no risk at all, because the federal government is standing behind it as insurance. It's a very powerful tool, and it's how you get the rows and rows of houses around America. Now, what became clear in the 1950s is that many home builders were, I think it's fair to say, abusing the system by in their paperwork exaggerating their costs, getting as big of a mortgage as possible, and then as is famous, building as cheaply as possible, substituting materials, using non-union labor, so on and so forth. And there were hearings in 1954 where Congress called them back and said, you ended up with, $5 million extra in your bank account. What were you doing? William Levitt was one of the star witnesses. Another star witness was Fred Trump. And this is a very important genesis moment for the Trump real estate empire. And so when I hear a lot of the abundance agenda today, which, the premise is that regulations, labor laws, various forms of roadblocks is what's holding back new construction in America. And it's not to downplay these obstacles at all. But I think the solution cannot just be tear down all the walls and deregulate, right? So if we're talking housing, my concern would be how do we ensure and guarantee that this actually results in affordable rents, say if we're building multifamily apartments, right? And this doesn't just become a new round of a speculative development. I am not sold by a kind of economistic model where we say if we just build enough units, supply and demand will balance themselves, because I think there are a whole host of actors in between, and there are all kinds of opportunities for abuse and exploitation that we need to be very aware of. And again, that's why we can't forget. Right? It probably was a good thing to have housing and a housing shortage in post-war America. But let's not forget that there are immense compromises made, essentially ceding the Trump real estate empire as one of the trade-offs for doing so. And so I would personally think that that is not a playbook we should repeat, right? That's not we need to kind of revise that model.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I would just add to that. It's kind of exhausting how simplistic the way that we t talk about these sorts of things. It's like this question of big government. Is government good or bad? Bad? Is regulation good or bad? Well, it's kind of both, right?
Yeah,
Um,
what regulations and for who and or what? Yes.
exactly. I mean, it can be a tool for the people that you dislike, or a weapon that they fear, depending on how it's wielded. Jay Huben writes, can you add to your critique of the public-private partnership model for development? And do you see us still falling into that same um, mindset with housing today?
Yeah, I mean,
With housing.
yeah, okay. So I guess, relevant to the history in my book and that I can talk about today, I think that, what this, the construction episodes, the profiteering, Fred Trump and William Levitt episodes, and just the kind of chronic shortages that come later in the rental housing crisis show is that I think we haven't appreciated enough how the public-private partnership model, it can be often very difficult to get to the private sector to the table. And in these partnerships, often, not always, but often what happens, and there's many examples in my book, is that the private sector is calling the shots. And I think this is certainly the case with real estate, right? So the argument I make after those episodes of the shoddy construction, of the profiteering, is that first generation white homeowners definitely benefited. I mean, no doubt about it. No money down for a new house. But I think you could argue, and I do argue, that the real estate sector benefited even more, right,
Sure.
from it. And so, yeah, I think you could extend this probably even further in the contemporary moment, because the public imagination, the public power, the public capacity has withered even further, right? Where at least aside from a few very exciting outliers like perhaps the Mamdani campaign and soon to be administration, most of what municipal governments looks like in across America today is let's design policies that are, with the interests of the private sector in mind, right? Because this is where the capacity is, this is where the capital is, right? So that is like something that, to go all the way back. And Peter, when your book comes out, we'll talk about this too. The federal government, we've lost a lot of that capacity, institutional capability to do things like this through the kinds of privatizing,
Yeah.
deregulating, defunding, to where I get it. If you're a mayor today or a legislator today, that you want stuff built, the playbook is let's talk about tax incentives, let's talk about subsidies, let's talk about giving land away to developers, because that's how it gets done today. As a historian, I want to say we've done it other ways in the past, right?
Yeah.
That there are problems, and this ends up being a dead end, right? If it's the kind of the private above all else in the partnership. And so I think at least I get to really boil it down, kind of reasserting, kind of the public side of these partnerships, right?
Well, let me toss another question in, my own. I mean, You're right, of course. And we were talking earlier about path dependence, and it's not just a term that people that do political science are familiar with, right? It's not just that these programs or policies or institutional frameworks in which they operate like sort of get set and then you're kind of stuck. People, the stakeholders and others are kind of set in this path and they're dependent on it, and et cetera. You lose all of the sort of that wider imaginary that you're referring to, right? There's no opportunity for political learning, to use another one of those phrases that the political development people talk about. Um, uh, we had a comment from one of our favorite longtime regular listeners, Lynn Hadley Finley, who referenced Tim Keogh's book, which we were talking about earlier in the session. Tim Keogh's book on post-war Long Island, which came out last year, and talking about Keogha Yamada Taylor's excellent book. Tim in his book uses this phrase suburban exceptionalism. And we were talking earlier about the political dynamic, and Susie was making the provocation about, the kind of next phase of the story is to try to get at this wider scope. You do an amazing job, and I'll second what she said earlier. You do an amazing job in this of doing what you talked about at the beginning, of sort of taking these big abstract beasts like the financial system, right, and trying to making that legible to people. You know, to me, I hear this and I think that there's an ideological problem, which is what Tim was getting at with that sense of suburban exceptionalism, right? That we are still in so many ways locked into this notion that for all the problems that the suburbs have, right? It's been 10 years, I think, since there was that big report that the Brookings Foundation put out that said the suburbs now were the region that had the greatest amount of poverty, and yet we still are trapped we're still in this nostalgia trap about the that comes out of the post-war era about suburbs are where you go. And so there's still all this policy that in terms of the policy debate and the solutions that people put forward, it's still this sense that the suburbs are the exception to poverty, right? And I don't know how to get around that kind of ideological trap except with some sort of reform within the political system. But I want to just reframe that as a question to you. How do we get around those things? Because it is, I think, that larger ideological political framework that also is constraining at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, for those people interested in poverty and poverty policy, Tim Keogh's book is incredible. I highly recommend it. Tim's a close friend. The book is amazing. I think maybe I'll say something a little bit different. As an urban historian, I think something we can really focus on here is the built environment.
Yeah.
Right? So this is its own kind of path dependence. You fly into LaGuardia or JFK, and you look out the window, and there are just houses everywhere, as far as you can see on Long Island, right? This is the world that we built primarily in the post-war era and earlier eras. This is the legacy that we now have. And so here, I think from my book, something that I actually think points to really exciting directions is the proliferation of illegal rentals, which I call informal housing. And I call it informal because it's not a secret. Everybody knows it's happening. The code officials know, the neighbors know, right? There are these incredible studies in the 70s and 80s that something like 5 to 10% of all the houses on Long Island are being rented. A room is being rented, whether it be the basement, the attic, garage, spare bedroom. Now, I think what that shows is that this path dependence, this single family only built environment.
For sake of the audience, I mean, you have a note in that when you bring that up at several points, you say, properly so as a responsible historian, but that's the reported number, and
Yeah.
there's good reason to believe that it's even higher, right? That
Yeah.
maybe twice that, or
Well, and I think it just shows that people are living within these constraints, and it's not all. And, that's why I think informal is the right frame for this, because it's not all criminality. It's my adult kid needs somewhere to live.
Sure.
My husband died, and I'm living on a pension. And I want to rent the attic to a young person, right? I'm divorced, and now I own this house, and I want to rent to somebody who needs a cheap apartment for their. This is what's happening now. it's happening there. Another something I've written about and I follow very closely and I care a lot about is the proliferation of basement apartments in New York City, right?
Mhm.
A similar informal housing market where, by some accounts, something like 1 in 20 New Yorkers, three or 400,000 people live in unregulated illegal basements. And this became really to the fore in Hurricane Ida when 11 New Yorkers died from drowning when the water rushed into the basements. And it's been a really thorny issue for uh, mayoral administrations since the 1990s what to do about this. And so, like, what I'm saying here is that this is a problem across cities and suburbs. And I think what it shows is that our housing stock is not meeting the needs of everyone, and yet people are improvising solutions, and I say that because, like, you'll meet some urbanists who say what we need to do is bulldoze the suburbs, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, uh, even if you could, usually bulldozing someone's home is not a great political program, right?
Yeah.
But I think it shows that, like, this is the answer looks something like finding ways to adapt what we have, finding ways to make the housing landscape we have more adaptable. What would it mean to make these New York City basements safe and livable so that every time it rains, people aren't worried, fearing for their lives? What would it mean that you wouldn't have to look over your shoulder to just live in an attic on Long Island, right? And so it's like pointing in this sort of direction, the kind of adaptability, the creativity, I think is what the question should be. Again, not, Peter, like you were saying, the how do we recapture the perfect suburb of our imagination or whatever, right?
Yeah. I guess my um, feeling on that is just that it's uh, we're already talking about kind of the practicality of how we would deal with this built environment, but we have to sort of get to that point, right? At a moment when it feels like that's so impossible, right? And not simply because we've lost this historical imaginary, right? But because there are these constraints that I'm not at all convinced are real in terms of where the majority of people are, right? Um, uh,
Yes.
but that's my own sort of leading a set of questions and interests. Mike, this book is really great. I said it before, there's underlining all throughout. This is a subject that I know well. I spent time on Long Island growing up. Tim is one of my very good friends. But I learned so much in this book. And you really do, as Susie said, make these big abstract systems quite accessible. And it was a pleasure to read. It's also very well written. So I want to congratulate you in the utmost on this. Very good to see you again. Susie, not surprised at all that you led a fantastic discussion tonight. You were,
Thanks. I had actually one thing I wanted to
yes,
ask Mike,
please. Yeah.
because when I think about my education, in Long Island, I mean, how great would it have been if we had learned about the institutional conditions that you know led to the kind of segregation and the problems that we're concerned with now as historians, as adults. And because you've taught yourself for many years in public schools, I was wondering how you can imagine that people would teach this story, how it is that we could talk to teachers, within the New York City public school system, because we spend so much time talking about like the New Deal, right? I teach U.S. history and so on. And I feel like these kinds of stories are so much more necessary and relevant to the kind of reality that we're living. I was wondering if you thought about that as an issue as a teacher.
Well, now I teach this stuff to college students. I would love to bring some of it back to high school students. The way I always teach is primary sources, right? So I would love to get in front of high school students. Let's look at this attack flyer from a school board election. Let's look at this redlining
Mhm.
report. Let's look at this bond contract, and let you kind of wrestle with this stuff. So that's how I like to teach, not imposing anything on anybody. But yeah, I was maybe just because people are scared of the suburbs, are scared by the 56 school districts, that I went around various archives and many archivists told me I was the first person to look at some of these primary sources. So I
Wow.
think that's the stuff I would like to get in people's hands. That it's out there if you go look for it.
Yeah. Peter, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. Just saying, Pleasure to see you as always. Thank you for your very thoughtful questions. And I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight and invite you all to join us in a couple of weeks where we'll be talking about the history of Queens and a fantastic new book that's come out on that borough. Mike, great to see you. Sorry we couldn't do this in person. Susie, we'll get together soon, hopefully. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and wish everyone a good night.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Susie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. I'm looking at this note that somebody wrote on the Q&A, Joe Sackman, about reaching out to the Long Island Progressive Coalition. That's great.
Yes,
And then also about Wantagh.
lipc.org.
Yeah. The Wantagh story is great
Yeah.
in your book. It's actually kind of astounding. And their relationships with Roosevelt. That was something I didn't know as well.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Good night.